Welcome in everyone to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host as always, Tommy Brzee. It is July 3rd, Wednesday around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about Florida State and Clemson. Some things are starting to happen that I feel like we've all known are going to happen for quite some time, but it feels like things are starting to move a little bit quicker. It sounds like the Big Ten is not too interested in adding Florida State and Clemson, and that leaves just the SEC, which we've heard does not have too much interest as well. So we'll break down kind of what that means for these two teams and how it could kind of leave them just kind of hanging there for a little bit. Then we'll get into Utah. They named Morgan Scalley, their defensive coordinator, as the head coach in waiting at Utah. Obviously, huge news there. Something that used to happen quite a bit, but has happened a little bit less as some rules have changed and some different things in college football have changed. And then we'll get into the Big 12 media poll. A ton coming out from the Big 12. We'll get all of these media polls over the next week or so, I would assume. And the first one to come out was the Big 12, Utah and Kansas State kind of leading the way out there. No surprise there by any means, but some very interesting things to break down. Then we'll get into recruiting. Commitments just continue to fly. I've been trying to take a couple of days off from recruiting, but you just can't around this time of year. So I want to get you guys updated on everything you need to know before we get into some Wednesday what-ifs and break down some new things about the realignment and how some things could be very weird this upcoming year and the different what-ifs that we're going into this year with. So we'll break down all of that on today's show, but before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of comments and questions throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen and we can have a fun back and forth here is to use the Tip and Donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcspodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to have a fun kind of interactive experience here, and that's always good for the both of us. So again, that's gsmcspodcast.net. But let's jump right in and let's talk about this new Florida State and Clemson news that came out over the last couple of days. Greg Swaim, a longtime radio host and a big-time college football guy, has said on his radio show recently that the Big Ten is not much interested in both of these schools, and it's because they don't have the AAU accreditation, which essentially just means they are not a big-time research university. That's something that the Big Ten holds very dear to them, and Nebraska came in with an AAU accreditation, lost it fairly quickly, and it sounds like the Big Ten is none too happy about that. So I think that's kind of the end-all be-all to a certain extent when you're talking about the Big Ten. If there are certain schools that have this accreditation, you have a shot to get in. If you don't, then you might just be looking from the outside in. And that's obviously the conference that pretty much everyone wants to go to because you get the biggest paycheck out of that conference. So this is obviously huge news for these two schools, but also Miami is an AAU accredited school, and it just got passed here, I believe, last year. So obviously that's something that could be coming down the barrel here pretty soon, where the Big Ten maybe is interested in some other ACC teams here in a little bit. But Florida State and Clemson overall, the big question here is, what does this mean for their future? How does this kind of impact where they're going from here? Because as of right now, if we're taking this at face value and this is entirely true, that's your only option, the SEC. The SEC is your only place to go at this point, at least if you want to go up. There's some other options if you want to take a little bit of a step down and kind of hang out a little bit in another second-tier conference, but that's not why Florida State and Clemson are doing this. I can almost promise you that. They want to get to one of the two big boys, the SEC or the Big Ten, and if the Big Ten's not a choice because of that AAU accreditation, then you might just have to move on and see if you can find a way into the SEC. And the problem with that is Brent McMurphy went on Paul Feinbaum about 2 weeks ago or so and says the SEC has no interest in Florida State and Clemson coming into their program, and they're more interested in the North Carolina schools and in the Virginia schools as they get into kind of building out this conference even more. And this is something that I've kind of talked about a lot on this show, where North Carolina and Duke are the wins. They are the huge brands in these conference, and obviously when you talk about college football, they're not necessarily the biggest names out here, but it doesn't change that they're huge. It doesn't change that when you look at North Carolina and Duke, you have the biggest rivalry in the ACC. That basketball rivalry is unlike anything else, maybe in all of college sports, to be totally honest with you. You bring that in, that's huge. These are two teams that are absolutely capable of putting on really good football programs going forward, because the North Carolina talent is really strong pretty much every year. So if these two schools start to lock down that state a little bit more and don't let some of the bigger schools come in and pluck some of the big time guys out of there, they're going to get better. So from the SEC's perspective, I fully understand why Duke and UNC are the two that they're looking at. They definitely would be the two that I would be looking at if I was evaluating all of these ACC teams. And all of that being said, it's not to say that Florida State and Clemson aren't fantastic brands and wouldn't add something to the SEC. But it is to say, they're not necessarily the top two on the pecking order, as we might think in the college football realm of thinking. But this is obviously something that's going to unfold over the next little bit. And I think the biggest thing that I've thought about as this realignment stuff has started to happen, and as, teams are building out 17, 18, 16 team conferences kind of all over the map right now going into this year, if you're willing to do that, you have the money to add more teams, right? You have the ability to add more teams. And if you're going to, add teams anyway, and it doesn't hurt your chances to add a North Carolina or a Duke down the road if you're the SEC in this scenario, why not add Clemson and Florida State? Why not add more to the shelf of what is just a remarkable group of schools they have out there, and plug in a Clemson and a Florida State into that conference and just add a little bit more. And obviously, there's some hurdles with, I know Florida does not want Florida State in that conference. I know South Carolina doesn't want Clemson in that conference. But all this to be said, you're kind of in an arms race, as we've talked about a lot with the conference realignment, and getting more of those big-time brands is never a bad thing. So whether it is UNC and Duke and you wait out for those two, or it's Clemson and Florida State and you look for those two, and then you also get Duke and UNC, there are a ton of options for what the SEC can do going forward, and a lot of the power is sitting in their hands. But obviously the question stands, what happens if the SEC actually isn't interested? What happens if Brent McMurphy was entirely correct and the SEC is just trying to wrap their head around what they are now before they move on to expansion, possibly a couple of years down the road? Florida State and Clemson are finding their way out of this conference. That is a bar none going to happen conclusion at this point. If you want to go from the ACC to the Big 12, you're not going to get a win. If you want to join the Pac-12, which isn't going to happen, but if somehow you wanted to pull that off, that's not going to be the win that you want it to be. Going independent and losing all of your negotiating power with the playoff and with media deals is a nightmare. So it's pretty much, if you're not in the SEC, you're taking a raw deal one way or the other. Now, one of the interesting things here is the Big 12 is obviously in a very interesting spot. They're currently sitting fourth if you're talking about the playoff distributions for these four conferences. But at the end of the day, let's just say in a hypothetical world, the SEC and the Big 10 are not interested in Florida State and Clemson, and the Big 12 go out and are able to grab them. They would almost immediately jump the ACC. They would be, once those next negotiations came up for the college football playoff, they would likely get a higher revenue share than the ACC. The change would be, pretty much them just swapping positions. So it wouldn't necessarily help Florida State and Clemson, because their issue all along has been the amount of money that is being brought in by this conference, and really just the energy by the conference commissioners, by the leadership around the conference to get the most out of the conference as they can, get the most out of these media deals and conference or college football playoff deals and everything in between. And they feel like that hasn't been done very well in the ACC. And if you move over to the Big 12, I think that it will be done a little bit better as we move into this next 5-10 years. But as of right now, you're not necessarily taking a better situation. You're probably taking relatively a similar situation, to be totally honest with you. So it really is kind of SEC or bust for both of these teams, and it's going to be one of those things that they're just going to have to kind of figure out. Do they want to go to the SEC? Are they, fully locked in just doing that? Are they still kind of poking their nose in the Big Ten direction and trying to get around that AAU accreditation hurdle that is going to be pretty hard to get around? But it doesn't change that, when you can get into the Big Ten, you definitely take that opportunity at this point. So it'll be fascinating to watch, because it feels like there currently are two options, because we're not entirely sure what the conversations have been between the Big Ten and Clemson and Florida State. But let's just say the Big Ten is not interested at all. You're down to one choice on where you can end up with actually getting what you want from Florida State and Clemson, which is just being at a better table, being at the one that gets a little bit more money dealt out to them every year and sits in a little bit better of a position when you walk into these negotiating rooms. So that's the ultimate goal by these two schools, and the SEC seems to be the only landing spot for that to happen. And it'll be fascinating to watch all of this unfold. And a fun little wrinkle that was kind of added to this in the last couple of days was apparently there was a report that came out that Clemson and South Carolina were asked to possibly move their rivalry game to Black Friday. It ended up happening to Georgia Tech, Georgia. I don't know if it was one or the other or both of them were moving, but regardless, South Carolina and Clemson were slated to move to that Friday night slot, I believe, and ESPN had requested that move, and Clemson essentially just said no. And it's not to say, you have to totally ingratiate yourselves all the way to every media company out there, but it is to say ESPN has some pull at SEC. There's no two ways about that. And the SEC offices, they care about what ESPN thinks, and this isn't necessarily the best way for Clemson to get backing from that part of the equation. And obviously, you don't really know how big of a role that will play, but it's going to play some type of role. And it's not necessarily going to help them in these conversations because there's going to be some people from ESPN that will be in those rooms, and just outright saying no to something that they wanted is not necessarily the best way to go about it. But also, I'm not necessarily against them saying no from a football perspective, because keeping that game on a Saturday is important, and doing what is important for your fans is priority number one. So not necessarily mad at Clemson for doing it, but just to say it could be a little bit of a hurdle as you kind of try to get into the SEC going forward. So obviously, this is going to be a wild couple of months. This is going to be everything is going to revolve around those two schools, and there's going to be so much happening around them where once they fall, it could be a landslide of teams leaving the ACC. It could be just those two are out, but regardless, they're leaving. And whether it's, the SEC or the Big Ten or the Big 12 or being independent for a little bit of time before joining a conference, they're walking out the door. And the ACC is going to have to figure out a way to essentially fight for their lives over the next little bit. If Florida State and Clemson come out tomorrow, let's say, and say they're leaving the conference, you have a very limited amount of time to figure out how you're going to backfill it so you don't run into that problem with ESPN where if you get down to 14 teams, they're out the door. I can almost promise you that. So it would be a very dangerous thing if they were sitting on their hands during this time. I'm sure they're not. I'm sure they're lining up plenty of teams that possibly could come in, but it's going to be crazy. ACC Media Days are coming up here pretty soon, and this will be topic number one, including the other teams coming into the conference. But let's be honest, this is the thing that everyone is going to be talking about throughout the entire week. It's going to be absolutely dominating conversation, and I think we're going to get some pretty concrete news here pretty soon about this. So it'll be fascinating to watch. Is it just the SEC or bust for these two teams? And if that's the case, is it bust? Do they not have the interest from the SEC that they need going forward? So it's two teams that you would never imagine would have trouble finding a new conference to play in, but that could be where they're sitting here in a couple of weeks. But it'll obviously kind of unfold over the next little bit, and we'll see what happens. But let's take our first break. We'll take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Morgan Scaley, a very, very talented defensive coordinator for Utah. Well, he just got a little bit of a title promotion at the very least. He is the head coach in waiting over there at Utah and has a ton of implications for the future of this program. So, want to break that down right after this, so stick with us.